Alright, so I think it was about roughly 3.5 years ago that we were sitting here talking about the third season of Fargo and going episode by episode. And I wasn't really thinking much about doing that for this season, especially since I hadn't really heard anything about it. Like, we did season 3 as it was airing, and obviously I'm only just now catching up to this one. But I haven't heard anything about it. I have no idea what happens in it up to this point. But but usually there you hear at least a little something, like maybe a performance that stands out, or some big thing happens in an episode or something, and people talk about it and you hear about it. And I was a little concerned that I felt like I just hadn't heard anything about this at all, despite how promising some of the advertising was, mainly the cast list. And I had heard positive things about, like, the trailers they released and stuff like that. But yeah, so and usually just in general, TV is the kind of thing where, unlike movies, I won't necessarily like try to see it as soon as I can. Usually, TV is more of a thing of when I get around to it, kind of thing, I guess. Just so you don't necessarily have to go through the whole process of going episode by episode, week by week, which really is a pain in the ass when it's something that ends up sucking, which you don't necessarily know or not going in. So, but eventually the curiosity got to me enough, and I'd already, seen the seasons up to this point, and the cast is extremely promising, especially with a lot of the interesting choices Chris Rock has been making lately. So, I figured we might as well just go into this and see what happens. So, as far as the first episode goes, this one is called Welcome to the Alternate Economy, which is setting us farther back than we have, because obviously that we've been really jumping around the timeline from season to season, because I want to say the first season, my memory's kind of vague, I want to say the first season was like in the mid-2000s, and then the second one was in like the 70s, or the late 70s or the early 80s, or somewhere in there, and I think 2010 was where the third season was, and now we're going all the way back. We actually start in like right in the 1900 area, and then we come forward in a few time jumps in this introduction that's showing us how basically the gangs communicate and deal with each other in this particular area in Kansas City, and eventually we get to what's going to be our present day, it seems, which is 1950. And talking about it being in Kansas City now, which is obviously kind of a bigger setting than usual. There's significantly more like buildings involved in the landscapes and stuff like that, and it just has an overall bigger feel. Yet somehow, I don't know if it's the way the characters interact or just the way this show has a great grasp on its tone just throughout each season, yet as one whole thing, that it still doesn't feel like it doesn't feel like it's on a bigger scale or anything just because it's in a bigger location. It still feels like as compact as like everything that came before it, which is very interesting. And of course, now that we have this sort of gangster vibe, one of the things we've been seeing a lot throughout each season is all the different callbacks to. Once again, going into it, you would think it would just be callbacks to the movie, but there are a lot of callbacks, whether it be lines or situations or the way a certain scene is shot will look very familiar. They're just calling back like anything they can pick out of the entirety of the Coen Brothers filmography. So it's always kind of fun to see those and how they kind of come into this same way. It shows just how much of a sort of signature that the Coen Brothers have, that you can take anything from any one of their movies and stick it into the world of just one of their movies, but it feels so seamless, like it belongs here anyway. And so now we're getting serious Miller's Crossing vibes, which I just did a video on earlier this year. And there's a lot of introduction, and the reason that that's both a good and a bad thing is, I suppose the reason it could be potentially a bad thing is it feels like we're getting a lot thrown at us, because there's also a lot going on, not just story-wise and character-wise, but also thematically, with like the racial differences and the prejudices and discrimination and all that stuff, and how that's tying into everything. But and there's even a moment when we actually get, like, as far as character goes, where we get the shots of the two gangs facing each other. The first time we see Chris Rock in the episode, and the way they do this is to sort of pan across each gang, and they're all like labeled, just like in one shot. Their name is in front of them, and that's a good technique visually. I don't know if it's effective in regards to remembering who is who still. But it's there. But it's also one of those cases where if you know like Ben Whishaw or Jason Schwartzman or whoever, you'll probably mostly be identifying them by their real name. But that kind of narrows it down where you can focus more on the side characters trying to remember who's who exactly, because you'll remember the famous faces when you see them, or the more famous faces when you see them. But this has 11 episodes, to my understanding. It's going to have 11 episodes when we reach the end at the end of this month. And the reason that's kind of concerning is because every other season has had 10 episodes up at this point, and something I have said about all three of the previous seasons was they didn't need 10 episodes. Even my favorite season, which was the first one, I feel like they could have... There's enough like filler in those seasons that it feels like they could have done with 8 episodes per season, I think. So I was concerned when I saw that we were bumping it up one more episode this time, but maybe possibly that's a good thing, because we clearly have so much to work with all we are introduced to in this episode. So we'll just have to see how that unravels. But what's really great about this in regards to seeing how the gangs interact is this really interesting and kind of brilliant concept of the two gangs trying to like have a sort of peace between the two of them by each gang offering up a son to the other side that they'll raise for, I'm guessing, possibly temporary period. I'm not entirely sure. Like I said, if I miss something, we're getting a lot of information thrown at us in this episode. So I'm sure whatever needs to come to light or anything I might have missed in this episode will come to light in later episodes. But it's just in this first sort of like 10 minutes or so, in the directions that these scenes go in, it's like there's such a ruthlessness immediately established in regards to like power plays and double crosses and stuff like that. And it's the whole thing where we get this it's sort of like the 3 rule, where usually it's like you see something is established, and then you'll see something established again, and there's a familiarity to it, and then the third one will kind of turn it on its head. But we do get this scenario of a trade-off of sons 3 different times between the different gangs over time, as we're getting like 5 to 10 year jumps in between. And it's the first time around, there is a big sort of double cross. So the second time it happens, you think, is it going to be different, or is that thing going to happen again? And it's like, it happens again, but in a kind of different way than the last time. So it's like, by the time we see that it's going to happen for a third time, and with the characters that are probably going to be the major characters throughout, there's an uncertainty going into it already. And so it appears to be the third outcome is basically we get to see the outcome is this entire season. So already, like in the first 10 minutes, that's extremely intriguing, and kind of seeing the dynamic between how the gangs work. And then by the time we get to the end of this, after the second double cross has happened, one of the major characters who is still a kid in this case, but ends up becoming Ben Whishaw, who is forced to kill his own father in this moment, is his father basically curses him and his family just before he's killed, which, once again, going back to Coen Brothers territory, reminds me of the opening scene of A Serious Man, where we know as soon as a curse was put on their family that it went down generations. So we'll see if that happens as drastically as it did in A Serious Man. Certainly more drastically here it would have to, given the different circumstances the characters are in. But yeah, and then finally, once we get to the end of this and all the introductions, we are finally shown the Fargo title card like 25 minutes into this episode, which is almost half of it. So so that's so that they use that amount of time to establish what's going on, and there's still stuff that we're needing to be introduced to throughout the rest of the episode. It's also worth noting, and where we get a lot of our sort of themes pretty much laid out, pretty much word for word without really having to interpret anything, is a teenager, I think she's 16, Ethelreda, and we're hearing basically what's going on through her narration, and her narration is basically a history paper that she's writing for school. A school that she's obviously very much discriminated against, and there's many scenes in succession of her being punished for seemingly no reason other than being too smart, apparently. And of course, this is the era where punishment means literally being paddled by some creepy dude in the other room. Uh, so, um, and she pretty much, she's kind of the character, like, like a lot of the seasons have had this continuing thing with the characters where we have one character that's kind of like the sort of personification of evil in a certain way, and the other that's kind of the moral center. And Ethelreda seems to be kind of our moral center because she's got that, even though she's like 16, she's got that wisdom about her, and she's like one of the only characters that's like uncorrupted, at least up to this point. And yeah, like we pretty much get all the themes pretty much laid out in actual words through her narration, where they're talking about how, like, not just all the racial differences, but like also the when you talk about like prejudice and discrimination and stuff like that, where she's talking about how like there's the black gang in the room, but there's also like the Italian gang, and she says something along the lines of like none of them are white, and they're all have, there'll be people somewhere in this little universe or outside of it that are prejudiced against them in one way or another. So in regards to them kind of trying to fit themselves into this crime world and kind of take power, it's also both gangs just trying to like find their place in America where they're kind of seen as like lesser beings. So there's, like I said, there's a whole lot going on here story wise and theme wise and all that other stuff. Um, but especially we get it especially from a first hand um, look when we see Ethelreda, not just in school, but also there's a moment like where she meets Jesse Buckley before we've really been formally introduced to Jesse Buckley's character, and there's like immediate like racist interaction and stuff like that, and the characters are like so casual about it too. Like she's like, oh, I'll just talk to this young girl this way. It's not like she'll apparently feel anything. Is how Jesse Buckley's character is. But we'll get more into Jesse Buckley's character later, who's probably the most interesting person we've been introduced to up to this point. Um, but there's also the way like the gangs see each other. Also, like even though they both have groups of people that are prejudiced against them, we have moments like where Jason Schwartzman in particular seems to think very low of Chris Rock's gang, and not necessarily just because they're a rival in the gang world. But going on that, we do have... Actually, let's talk about Chris Rock's presence here, where I do think it's been interesting to see all these choices he's been making, especially in something like this, because I know he's been gushing about it being like the best part he's ever been given and the best part he's ever played. But there was kind of a thing where it was like when you go back and watch him in like Nurse Betty, it's like even though Nurse Betty's great in its own right, it's like when you watch him in that movie with like the dialogue he had and the kind of character he was playing, it was almost like Nurse Betty was almost like him auditioning for like a Coen Brothers, if not a Coen Brothers movie, at least a Coen Brothers project, which this fits that close enough. And there's a lot of different things going on with his character also, and what's so interesting about it is right now, even though he's like one of the central characters, I still feel like he's kind of hard to read a little bit, which is a good thing, because it keeps you kind of intrigued and wanting to come back to him and see what exactly he's going to do with what's already in front of him. Because while he does obviously establish himself as the leader of his particular gang, there's also, we get his home life, where we see him with his family, and he seems relatively normal when he's with his family, despite a comment he makes about how he's hoping this will turn out eventually. And then there's also a moment where Ethelreda's... There's a whole other plot going on where Ethelreda's interracial parents, which is a whole other thing in itself. There's like a money situation, and they seem to owe him, or at least the father owes Chris Rock something, and he's just kind of sitting at the table in this very sort of like godfathery way. And so there's like, you can always kind of sense like a level of intimidation going on without words, because we're pretty much seeing this from Ethelreda's perspective as she kind of is taken out of the room. Um, but then there's also another thing going on, and sort of talking about people trying to just kind of find their place in general, and not just in the gang world. It appears that Chris Rock's character has created the credit card. And he's trying to sell us in very much a way like Tim Robbins was trying to sell the idea of the hula hoop in Hudsucker Proxy. I'm going to assume that is not a coincidence. And so there's, with all the different layers we have to all these different characters, I do feel like I can see this episode being criticized for throwing way too much into it, but I do feel like it's one of those cases where once we... Yeah, I think this is a fair way to look at it. Once we know the whole story and we see it all play out in these next 10 episodes, if we were to come back to this episode knowing everything, like it only I feel like, I'm hoping it only feels like a lot right now just because we don't know what we're getting into just yet. So I feel like this would be like, we'll be able to come back and see that this was actually a jumping off point for a lot of things that were... obviously they're all going to be relevant, because there's obviously the case where you start to wonder if... how you kind of worry about which parts of this are going to be relevant and which parts maybe aren't going to be. Where like maybe they'll start focusing on something else, and something that maybe you might find more interesting now will end up getting like, pushed to the back in favor of other storylines or plot devices or whatever. So I guess we'll see how that goes. As far as like the tone in regards to it being, because it does come off very dark, especially with kind of the, like I said, the ruthlessness of the opening 10 to 25 minutes. But obviously this whole thing is also known for its dark comedy, if we're going not just the Fargo route, but in general the Coen Brothers route, and how Hawley has been able to really adapt that tone for this series up to this point. It does seem to be approaching it, even though Hawley's been pretty hands-on for like the whole show, this one almost feels a bit more like it's... Like, I don't know if it's because of how dark the dark angle is and the stuff when we're getting that, but the comedy feels like it's a little bigger than usual. Like, it's not necessarily completely in the sort of biting way or kind of a subtle way. Because obviously not all of the Coen Brothers comedy is going to be subtle, or that style of comedy or whatever, but, like, there's the really interesting scene when, Jason Schwartzman's father, the kind of head of that side of the crime family, is Donatello, I think the character's name is. This really big fucking guy. I can't tell if he's really big or if he's really big compared to Jason Schwartzman. But, because there's that great moment where we kind of get a good dynamic between them when they're in the back of the car right before this big scene happens. And the way he, like, leans in, and like I said, he just looks huge next to Jason Schwartzman, so there's something really kind of big and intimidating about him. Apart from what we've already seen this character do and take part in before. But then there's this tone juggling moment where they are stopped, and it looks like they might possibly be about to be ambushed. And while simultaneously that tension is building, it seems that Donatello might be having a heart attack. And so you talk about, like, a lot of movies, like when we talk about Tarantino movies and stuff like that, where it's like you build up the tension and then you cut it off with comedy, or the other way around, or kind of mixing the two together. This one is kind of a tennis match of that kind of tone, and playing with it, where this eventually maybe that's the point, unexpectedly, leads to just a giant fart joke. which might seem very, but that's the thing is just when you're getting settled into the fact of wow, that's, I mean, of all the punchlines or payoffs this scene could have had, that's a little over the top comedically. But then, like, it's almost something out of a Sandler movie or something. But then they hit you again, and the tone changes again when, after we've had this back and forth of severe tension, followed by a joke that would fit a Sandler movie, then we get the bloodshed that we were expecting, but in a very absurd way. And it's like the way this scene plays out when they are, obviously because of the prejudice and all that, they have to bounce around from one hospital to the next because they are denied the first one they go to because of who they are, or the kind of people they are, as the doctor says. And of course, there's this whole thing of the prejudice is just going to go in circles endlessly because there's the whole thing of they get denied this hospital by this doctor because he's prejudiced, and then when they go to the hospital that actually does take him, Jason Schwartzman doesn't like the doctor there and insists on getting a real doctor, and not even realizing that, yeah, just not putting it together. So, and there's still stuff going on. All of this has gone on before we really go back into Jessie Buckley's character and whatever the hell is going on with her, which is very intriguing because she's got the it's an interesting kind of contrast, and almost like it almost feels like a fake out if we didn't have the scene at the funeral home where we realize how racist Buckley's character is, and is willing to be right to a 16-year-old girl, but she's got the Minnesota accent. Which we come to establish in other settings that is typically associated with just like nice people and warm people and welcoming people and stuff like that, like the Marge Gundersons of the world. And she's really anything but that. If anything, she is the absolute and complete opposite of that. But the thing is I still kind of struggle to say that because there's still so much mystery surrounding what exactly it is that she's doing and what her particular motive is. I've said before, in particular when I just talked about I'm thinking of ending things recently, that while Jessie Buckley is a certainly breaking out and is already beloved up to this point in the short career that she's already had, I'm one of those people that I'm one of like the only people where she hasn't really made an impression on me yet, but this might be that impression. Like I think I said when I saw about I'm thinking of ending things that like I was just kind of I felt like any minute now was going to be that time where it's like okay, I see why people are drawn to her now. This might be it because it's I mean not only is it the performance but it's the character a lot also. I just really want to know where this is going, which is a really good place to be in the first episode of a season. So. Like I said, there's always that, we always have the kind of moral center, and then we also kind of have, like, we have to have, like, the Lauren Malvo character, or at least something, maybe not to that extreme, but close enough. And it appears that Buckley is going to be that character, and there's something so effortlessly creepy about her, too, like the way she sings, and when she gets off the bus and goes back into her house, and she's, like, muttering to herself, and in that very last shot, right before it ends, when we pan across the street, where she lives across the street from Ethelreda, of course, and she seems to just be watching them in this really creepy manner. And there's a dude just standing in the middle of the street, which also could not be more creepy. So yeah, it's one of those cases where you know the last shot, whatever it was going to be the moment where you said, "All right, now I have to see where this goes." That's a pretty good start in regards to the whole I need to know where this is going next sort of thing. So yeah, so I can see problems where it's like we're getting a lot all at once, a lot of characters, a lot of names, a lot of different motives, a lot of different things people want. But this is definitely enough to where to warrant wanting to go on. So I was kind of worried I was going to commit to this whole hey, let's do the episode by episode thing again, and then I was like the first episode in it was going to be like, well, I regret doing this now. But no, I'm curious if it can hold up like this. Then it'll probably be just fine. I know a lot of people didn't care for season 3 at all. And I don't know if it's just because I don't typically do the going week by week thing that I was intrigued enough. But like if I just watched it as a whole, maybe I wouldn't have been as into it. But I don't know. But those Ewan McGregor performances, plural, are really kept me coming back, just single handedly, or double handedly, whatever you want to call it. But yeah, so we'll see where this goes. And I don't really. Normally, this is the part where people would like predict where certain things are going, but honestly, just not even the slightest fucking clue. Which, like I said, is probably the best place to be. So, we'll see. Maybe when we get into it later, and the story kind of starts, more aspects start to come a bit more to light. Maybe we can kind of play with that kind of thing. But in the meantime, I'm just gonna see where it takes me. So, that seems more fun to me actually, is to not try to be ahead of it, to just kind of let it happen and see if whatever sneaks up on us. So. I guess I'm going to leave that at this. So until the next episode, I think that's it.